They tagged me Specimen 41 the morning after the harvesting ships took the valley. The number went on in a resin that wouldn't scrub off, just above the wrist, and then they ran me through 3 scanners before any of them bothered to speak a word I understood. The Severin do not interrogate, they catalog. I learned that distinction in the first hour. Strapped to a slab under panels of daylight they piped in through some trick of mirrors and filament, bright as a noon I hadn't seen in weeks. A Severin clerk in pale ceramic plating read my vitals off a slate and recited them to a second clerk, who recited them to a third, who filed them somewhere I would never see. Height, mass, scar tissue, old and new, bite pattern. They were thorough the way a man counting nails into a jar is thorough. Not cruel, just complete. I spent 6 weeks in the holding wing of that scanner bay, bright the whole time. The Severin keep their processing halls lit like an operating theater around the clock because, I was told later, by the one of them who eventually spoke to me as something other than an entry, darkness in a ledger is where mistakes hide. A fact you can't see clearly isn't a fact yet, to them. So the light never dimmed, and I never slept more than in pieces, and I got good at telling time by the angle the bars threw shadows across the floor instead of by any clock. There were others in that wing, a long row of us behind identical bars, each cell its own little glass-fronted file, numbered in the order they'd been dragged in, rather than anything that made sense to us. I knew 2 of the men by sound before I ever saw their faces, because we talked low at night when the duty clerk on rotation favored his slate over his eyes. One had run a grain mill before the ships came. The other had been a boys' school teacher and still corrected our grammar out of habit, which none of us minded, because it was the only thing in that wing that hadn't changed about him. We didn't talk about getting out. We talked about home, the way men do when home is the only thing left that nobody can scan. The cell across from mine wasn't ours. It belonged to the overseer's own kind. I found that out the way you find out most things in a place built to keep you from finding out anything. By accident. A junior clerk wheeled a tray past my bars one bright afternoon, and on it lay a Severin hatchling, small as a folded coat, wrapped in a gray membrane shot through with veins that didn't pulse right. Even I could see that. The clerk parked the tray in the cell across from mine, because the overseer himself, a tall, pale-plated Severin named Talakar, kept his sick clutchmate close to his own duty station, rather than send it wherever the Severins send things that won't catalog as healthy. Maybe their ledgers didn't have a clean entry for a hatchling like that. Maybe that was the whole problem. I had watched Talakar for 6 weeks by then, without meaning to. He was the kind of overseer who walked the row at the same pace every time, who corrected a junior clerk's posture with a single word and never raised it twice, who seemed to believe that if a thing was recorded precisely enough, it could be trusted to behave precisely. He had never once looked at me the way a man looks at another man. I was a height, a mass, a set of scars. That was not cruelty either. It was just how his kind kept the world from sliding into noise. Talakar came by twice a shift to look at the hatchling through the glass. He never touched it. He stood with his hands folded the Severin way, 3 fingers laced over the 4th, and watched the thing's narrow chest rise and fall, and wrote nothing down. That was the part that told me how much trouble it was in. Talakar wrote everything down. Watching him write nothing was like hearing a man's heart skip. I had a length of bed slat in my cell, the kind they give you to sit on so the floor doesn't take your spine apart over 6 weeks. I'd worked a rivet loose from the slat's hinge 2 nights in, out of nothing but the habit of hands that need a job, and I'd kept it hidden under my tongue during the scans, because some instinct said a man should hold on to one thing they haven't cataloged. I didn't have a plan for it. I just didn't want them to have everything. The night the hatchling's breathing went thin and fast, I sat against the bars and worked that rivet against the slat for hours, shaving a curl at a time, the way my grandfather had taught me to whittle a duck out of pine when I was a boy too small to be trusted with a knife that mattered. He used to say a knife that mattered was any knife at all, that the size of the blade had nothing to do with what you owed the wood. I didn't have a knife that mattered, by his measure or anyone's. I had a rivet and a piece of bed slat, and 6 weeks of bright, sleepless nights, and my hands remembered the motion better than my mind did. The short draw, the turn, the short draw again, and by the time the duty clerk changed shift, I had a bird. Not a good one. Dub-winged, lopsided, the kind a boy makes before he's learned a bird needs a keel to balance on. But it had a head you could tell was a head, and wings you could tell were wings. and I'd rubbed the grain smooth enough with my thumb that it wouldn't bite when you held it. I waited for Talakar's morning round. He came, hands folded, looked through the glass at the hatchling the way he always did, and wrote nothing down, the way he always did. I got as close to my own bars as they allowed, and held the bird out flat on my palm, in the bright light, where he couldn't miss it. He didn't move for a long moment. I think the Severin have to decide to look at something that isn't on a slate. It isn't automatic for them the way it is for us. Then he took it, 3 fingers and the laced fourth, careful as a man lifting something off a shelf he didn't trust to hold its weight. He turned it over once. He carried it to the hatchling's tray and set it against the membrane near the small clenched hand, and the hand, I watched this happen, I'm not telling you a story I heard. The hand opened and closed around one stub wing, slow, the way a hand does when the rest of the body has stopped asking it to do anything at all. Talakar stood there a long time after that. Then he picked up his slate and, for the first time since they'd brought me into that bright wing, he wrote something down while looking at the hatchling instead of at the slate. I don't know what the words were. I know he looked at me afterward, the way you look at a man you're revising your opinion of in real time, which is a particular kind of look, and not a comfortable one to be on the end of. The hatchling lived 4 more days. I don't tell people it lived, because it didn't, not in the way that would make this a different kind of story. But it lived 4 more days, holding a stub-winged bird a captured man had carved out of a bed slat with a stolen rivet. And on the second of those days, Talakar opened my cell himself, no clerk, no escort, and stood in the doorway long enough to say 4 words in passable trade tongue. You are not 41. He didn't say what I was instead. The Severin don't make declarations without a category ready to hold them, and I don't think he had one yet. But he didn't put me back in that cell. He had me moved to a holding room with a real door instead of bars, and a clerk brought me food on a schedule meant for someone, not something. 3 days after the hatchling died, the Severin Command opened a channel to what was left of our Valley Council and offered terms no harvesting fleet offers. Terms that named the rest of us as something other than entries in a ledger. I heard later that the school teacher and the miller were on the first transport home under those terms, and that the wing they'd been held in was quietly decommissioned within the season. Its bright lights finally switched down to something a man could sleep under. I keep no copy of those terms. I kept the rivet though, the second one, the one I never used. I wear it on a string around my neck the way other men wear a coin or a tooth. Not because it did anything, because I made it in the dark, with my own hands, before anyone had decided what to call me, and that's worth holding on to longer than any number they paint on your arm.